Okay, good morning. Certainly, it is no surprise to know who Kyle Wiley Pickett is. You might be interested to know of how he got here and his life story. I'm very pleased to give the microphone over to Randy Stewart with KSMU, who knows him extremely well and therefore can ask him some very penetrating questions. Okay, here you go.
All right. You know, symphony orchestras in this country have had a hard row to hoe in the past 20 or 30 years in terms of funding, in terms of just plain success, in terms of just plain staying open and for business. In fact, a number of major orchestras have undergone bankruptcy and had to reorganize. The Detroit Symphony, I guess, was the most recent one. But we've had instances here in the Midwest as well. Kansas City, there was a Kansas City Symphony that's now the Kansas City Philharmonic. Oklahoma City was another one that had problems. The Springfield Symphony, though, has had an unbroken, I won't say an unbroken record, that's kind of a bad pun. They've had an unbroken performance tradition going back to the 1930s, and it's been dynamic music directors such as Kyle that have kept this orchestra viable. And in fact, the past few seasons, I guess you've kind of set records for ticket sales and so on, and I guess ticket sales are going very well this year too. So I'll jump in a little bit later after Kyle does an initial sort of presentation and ask penetrating questions of some kind or other. But here is Maestro Kyle Wiley Pickett from the Springfield Symphony.
Thank you. Thank you, Randy. Thank you all for having me today. I'm really actually extremely happy to be talking to this group. And you know, I do a lot of talking in my job as conductor of the Springfield Symphony, and I talk to anybody and everybody who will invite me, but it's great to talk to a group of people who are musicians and musically minded. That's actually a lot of fun. It's a little bit different than the normal talks I give, you know, just to civic organizations promoting the symphony. And so I thought I would talk today a little bit about this weird job of being a symphony conductor. It's a very strange, it's a very unusual job, and it's a weird way to be a musician, because in an average year I conduct about 30 concerts, give or take a few, maybe a few more, 30, 35 concerts. That's usually over the school year time, so basically from September till May, I'm doing those concerts. If you total those up, there's probably a couple hours of music on each of those concerts, so 2.5 hours, so 60 to 70 hours of symphonic music that I'm responsible for over the course of a year. And in those 60 to 70 hours of actual music making, I'm the only guy on the stage who doesn't make a sound.
You're not supposed to.
I'm not supposed to anyway. Yeah, no, I'm the only guy on the stage who doesn't make a sound, except for occasionally talking and introducing a piece or saying something about the music. And yet I'm the guy who gets to come out. I get the applause at the beginning. I take the bow for the orchestra. I get the applause between every piece. I get to take the bow for all of the very hardworking musicians who are putting together the concert. And then at the end, I get the big bow and the big applause. And I'm the guy who just had my back to the audience the whole time, waving my arms at the orchestra. That's a weird way to be a music maker. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about that and tell you how I got here, tell you what that means to be a music maker who doesn't make any music, or at least doesn't make any sound when they're making music, and then let Randy, talk to me a little bit and take any questions that you might have about this. First of all, just a little introduction of myself. I'm in my 6th year now with the Springfield Symphony. So I came in 2013. I've had 5 seasons here. I also conduct the Topeka Symphony in Topeka, Kansas. So we live here, and then I'm up in Topeka about 1 week a month or so. And in Topeka, we have a symphony that's similar in size to the Springfield Symphony, maybe just a little bit smaller, and we do 7 subscription concerts instead of the 9 that we do here in Springfield, and and the affiliated other concerts, kids concerts, school concerts, those kind of things as well up in Topeka. So I go back and forth. And people say, oh, that's sort of strange that you're in charge of 2 orchestras, but it's actually really, really common for a regional conductor like myself to have 2 orchestras. Some have 3. And in my previous jobs, before I came to Springfield, I conducted an orchestra in Northern California called the North State Symphony that was in the cities of Chico and Redding, way up where it's all on fire right now. And then the Juneau Symphony in Alaska. So I commuted back and forth between California to Alaska on a regular basis. So actually Springfield to Topeka is a pretty easy little jaunt compared to my previous commute. Topeka doesn't look quite like Alaska, so it's a little bit different, when I get there. But great community, great orchestra, and in Topeka as well as here. So I'm really fortunate to be out here. I'm originally from the Bay Area in California. That's where I grew up, and that's where I really got my start in music. My dad was not a musician, but he was a bit of an audiophile music lover. He grew up in the Bay Area. He was born in San Francisco. My mom was born in Napa, so we're kind of a Bay Area family. And so Dad, who is passed now, but was a bit of an audiophile, and I've got his equipment in my basement. I've got the giant JBL 1967 speakers. Each one's about the size of a Volkswagen Bug. I've got the cabinet full of records, and every time we move, my wife says, "Can we get rid of these records, please?" And I say, no. And she says, "You never listen to them." I said, "But I have them, and that's the important thing." And in fact, we were cleaning the basement this weekend, and I found the big reel-to-reel player and the reel-to-reel tapes, which also I never used, but I probably won't ever get rid of because those came from Dad. He was a fan of, some of you might remember, Kingston Trio, Pete Seeger. My folks dragged me around. I saw Pete Seeger in Stern Grove in 1977, and only as an adult do I realize what that smell of that smoke was that was hovering over the entire Stern Grove. And I've gone back and actually found pictures of that concert. It was a pretty famous concert, and boy, that was a hippie fest that I did not understand when I was like a 6 or 7-year-old kid. I actually got to see Pete Seeger quite a few times. Every time he came to the Bay Area or South Bay, we'd go to see him. So Dad loved folk music. He loved bluegrass. And every Sunday afternoon, all afternoon, he'd put on bluegrass and we'd listen to bluegrass. So even though I grew up in the Bay Area, there's a musical connection to the Ozarks that I had from early childhood. Now, my mom is a musician. She's a music teacher. She's a piano teacher. She still is a piano teacher. She was an elementary school music specialist. And she went to Berkeley in the 60s and did her music education degree. And at that time, there was a composer and teacher named Zoltan Kodály, who came over from the Czech Republic or Hungary, actually. Yeah, although he's got yeah, you're right, in Budapest. Thank you. I know these things. You do, thanks. There's someone to keep me honest up here. That's good. Or at least fact check me on this. Kodály actually set up largely the way that we teach music in the schools in the United States. And so my mom was fortunate enough to get to actually study with him. And one of his philosophies of music education is that kids learn music through their folk music. And so folk music becomes the basis of music education. It goes a lot farther than that, but that's the fundamental idea behind Kodály's method of music education. So that fits in real well with Pete Seeger, right? And the Kingston Trio and the Weavers. And so there was an affinity my parents had based on that. So my mom was my first music teacher. So I started studying piano with my mom at about age 5. And it went pretty well for a couple years, and then she decided I needed a different teacher. And it wasn't because we didn't get along. We actually got along probably too well for her to be my teacher. She felt like I needed someone who would be strict and kind of hold me to standards and not be sympathetic as a mom is. If you don't have time to practice because you have homework or something like that, your piano teacher should say, nope, you practice anyway. Your mom might say, well, I understand. So I switched to another teacher. Now, I'm going to get to how I became a conductor in this next little phase, which is when I was in 5th grade. That was the time when we chose an instrument, a band or string instrument to play. And I always kind of wanted to play the trumpet. But for some reason, when the time to choose an instrument came around, I chose the flute. It was probably because my grandfather had played flute in the band in high school. He said he was never good at it. In fact, when I knew him, he mostly played harmonica and sang. But we had his old flute around, and I picked it up, and I could actually kind of play it. And so it seemed like a good fit. And so I started playing the flute. And as it turns out, being a boy who plays the flute in high school marching band is not necessarily the easiest thing to be. When you're 14 and you're a freshman in high school and you go and your time on the football field involves carrying a flute around and not a football around, that's a little bit rough. The other thing about that is that I always like to say that the very definition of futility is playing a flute on a football field. That is an instrument that cannot be heard on outside almost at all, certainly not when you're on a giant football field, and if the wind blows, you can't even play that instrument. So I played flute in the marching band. We had a pretty serious marching band program. I played it pretty seriously, and I had good teachers, and I kind of excelled at that instrument. It was a good fit for me. But I decided that for my social standing, I would be better off as the drum major of the marching band than as a flute player in the marching band. And that really was my first conducting at all, as I would lead the marching band in the field shows. And we had a pretty good program. We did a lot of field show competitions throughout the state, and we had, played at all the football games. And I realized I actually really liked conducting. The other thing that happened was by my senior year of high school, I made it into a pretty prestigious youth orchestra. It was called the California Youth Symphony. And we did really major repertoire with that orchestra. So the kind of pieces that you hear the Springfield Symphony play, we were doing with this youth orchestra. And I fell in love with some of the music that we were playing. Some pieces that we're actually playing this year with the Springfield Symphony. The Hindemith Matisse Mahler Symphony is a piece that we did with that youth symphony. We're playing that this year with the Springfield Symphony. It's the first time the Springfield Symphony's ever played this piece of music. And one of the things that really stood out to me in that experience was how much I enjoyed all of the music that was being played and how limited I felt by playing only one line of that music. So I was only playing the flute line, and there are all these other amazing lines of music that are happening, and I didn't get to participate in that. And the only way that you can actually participate in all those lines of music is if you're actually the conductor. And so that also sparked my interest in conducting. When I went off to college, I actually had not planned to be a professional musician. You hear stories from a lot of people who say, from the time I was 4 years old, I heard an orchestra and I knew that's what I had to do in my whole life. And I was not one of those kids. I liked it, I did it, but I had a pretty big variety of interests. And so when I went off to college, I was intending to maybe go into politics or law or something along those lines. But my mom, who was also not encouraging me to be a professional musician, said, look, you've spent your entire life studying music up to this point, and go off to college and do whatever you want to do, but why don't you take a few music classes anyway? Because it's familiar, it'll keep you grounded, it's something that you know, and that turned out to be good advice. The other thing that happened, and this is the really significant event in my life, was I wanted to keep studying flute at a high level. And so when I went to Stanford University, and there was a flute teacher at Stanford University. Actually, she just passed away a couple of years ago. Her name was Frances Blaisdell. And I'd heard about her, but I didn't know a lot about her as a 17-year-old kid. But I knew that she was considered to be one of the great flute teachers, and so I was hoping that I would be able to study for her. And I called her when I'd been accepted to the university, and she said, look, I can't tell you you're going to be in my studio. You got to come in, you got to audition for me. when you get to school. And so when I got to school, I went in and I played for her, and I played this piece. It's a flute piece by one of the few women composers who gets done quite a bit. It's a woman named Cécile Chaminade. She wrote this little flute concertino, and I played it for Frances. And at the time, she was in her 70s. She just passed away a couple of years ago, and she was 96 years old. She was still teaching full-time. She was the oldest faculty member at Stanford. She still had a full class of students. She was in her 70s when I auditioned for her. She looked at me for a while, and then she said, okay, I'll take you as one of my students. And that was the transforming moment for me. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about Frances and why that was transforming. So Frances, as I mentioned, was already, well into retirement age when I studied with her. She was a woman of firsts. She was the first woman to be accepted at the Juilliard School of Music, which is, of course, one of the major conservatories in the United States. And she was the first woman to be a full member of the New York Philharmonic. Those are really significant things. And they're partly significant because in order to be that first, she had to be the best. And she really was the greatest, the best of her generation. And I was fortunate enough to study with her because she and her husband was Alex Williams, who was the principal clarinetist of the New York Philharmonic for 30 years. And after Frances and Alex retired from the Philharmonic, they moved out to the Bay Area. And Stanford found out she had come to the Bay Area, and they said, hey, we need a 1-year interim flute teacher. This was like in 1974 or something. And she said, well, I'm really done. I'm really retired. I don't want to teach anymore. And but they talked her into teaching for 1 year, and then she taught for another 35 years at Stanford. I mean, I don't think she predicted she'd be teaching until she was 96 years old there. Now, what was significant about working with Frances, aside from the fact that she's probably the greatest flutist of the 20th century in America, was that she had worked with all of the major musical figures of the 20th century. I mean, you name him, and it was usually him, and she had worked with him. So Toscanini, or who conducted the Philharmonic, or Stokowski, who was at the Philadelphia Orchestra, all of the composers, Copland and Shostakovich and Rachmaninoff, who we are playing this week with the Springfield Symphony. And you walked into her house, and their hallway was like a museum of great classical musical figures of the 20th century. I mean, it was just photograph after photograph, and it was always personal. Frances, thank you for dinner the other night. And so when I was working with her, I had a direct line to some of these titans, these great geniuses of the musical world. And you say, well, why is that a significant thing? Well, music is an odd form. I mean, classical music especially, we work off of these scores that look like this, and we've got a bunch of lines and a bunch of dots. You all know what a sheet of music looks like. But a sheet of music is basically a foreign language, right? I mean, it's a notation system that is communicating to us how something is supposed to sound based on text that you write down on paper. And that is an inherently imperfect form. You cannot communicate everything that needs to be communicated about how music is supposed to be played or produced based on lines and dots on a page. And so when you're working with someone like Frances, who knew Aaron Copland, who commissioned pieces from him, then when I'm playing a piece by Aaron Copland, she can tell me, this is what Copland said about this piece. We have the lines and the dots. I can look at that, but I can't have that direct experience of the composer's knowledge unless I have connection with someone like Frances. And I'll tell you a specific story. There's a flute piece by a guy named Edgar Varèse. You may or may not have heard of Varèse. Varèse is he's one of the most influential 20th century composers, but he only has like 8 pieces, and which is a strange thing. I mean, usually you think of an influential composer like Bach, who has this output that's, you know, as large as the rest of the people of his time period. Varese has 8 pieces. Part of the reason Varese has 8 pieces is because he burned everything he didn't like. So everything else that he wrote, if he didn't feel like it lived up to this standard, he burned it. Part of the reason is nobody really liked his music outside of the other composers who listened to it and learned from it. You know who liked Varese was Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa liked Varese. That was, you know, one of the major influences on Zappa. But he was also a major influence on Leonard Bernstein and Aaron Copland and, you know, all the classical composers. He wrote a very famous flute piece called Density 21.5, and it's for solo flute. So it's like a 5-minute piece, and it's just for flute, nothing else. And it's a little bit odd, but it's kind of a cool piece, and it's kind of a standard modern piece, so that most flutists play it at some point or other. It's called Density 21.5 because that's the density of platinum. And Francis, my teacher, her teacher, commissioned this piece because he had built for himself the very first platinum flute. And so he wanted a piece to introduce this platinum flute, which I, by the way, have actually gotten to play, the platinum flute. It sits in the museum of, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. So if you go to the Met, you can see this platinum flute there in their instrument collection. So Varese wrote this piece, Density 21.5. And I remember being in college, I'd studied the piece, I'd played it before, and then I was working on it for Frances, and I was playing it for Frances, and Frances couldn't see very well by the time I was studying with her. I mean, she wasn't completely blind, but she really couldn't see the dots and the lines on the page. And so she listened, and I was playing, and she stopped me. She said, "No, you're doing that wrong." And I looked at the music, and I said, "All right, I'll try it again." And I tried it again. She said, "Stop. You're doing that wrong." And I looked at it again. I said, and you don't correct someone like Frances, but I said, "Frances, I think I'm doing it right." She said, "Nope, you're doing it wrong. Play it again." So I played it again. She said, "Nope, it's wrong." And at that time, you know, I played exactly what was written down. And she said, "Well, let me check." And so she went up and she got her file cabinet and she pulled out her copy of Density 21.5. And it had handwritten corrections by Varese where he had fixed a wrong note that was in the printed score, but it never got changed in the published score. And so I was playing what was published, what was printed on that page, but it was not what Varese wanted it to be. And so again, you know, just that's a tiny, tiny example of the benefits of getting to work with someone like Francis, who had that history with the composer himself. There are other things about Francis that are amazing. You know, the whole way that we do auditions in the symphony orchestra now is changed because of Francis. So her husband, Alex Williams, principal clarinetist of the New York Philharmonic, I'm going to tell you how he got his position in the Philharmonic. And this is not a joke. It sounds like a joke, but it's not a joke. So he was 17 years old, and you go in front of a panel of the other woodwinds. So he's auditioning for the clarinet spot. So that means you get the principal flute, oboe, bassoon, and French horn. Those 4 men, and they were men, listened to that audition. Presumably Toscanini was in there too, but I've never heard that he was there. So maybe not. But you had those 4 guys listen to these, and so they heard a bunch of players. And they chose a few that they liked, and they liked Alex. And so they gave him 2 or 3 concerts with the Philharmonic where he gets to come in and sit with them and actually play during concerts, which is honestly, that's the best test. You can't really tell how someone is going to play unless you play with them. And then if they like you, then they invite you to play poker. So they invited him to play poker. And then if you lose enough money, you get the job. That's not a joke. It sounds like a joke, right? But that's how he got his position in the New York Philharmonic. He was 17 years old, this kid. Didn't play poker, or maybe played poker very well. I mean, you know, pretty smart. So Frances, you know, when a spot opens up, she's married to Alex by this time. A spot opens up in the New York Philharmonic. There's a lot of history to this, but a spot opens up in the New York Philharmonic. She tries to get an audition, and they say, "No, I'm sorry, we don't accept women in the Philharmonic." And It seems weird to us to say that, but honestly, it wasn't until 1967 that they started accepting women in the Philharmonic, or in any of the major orchestras, really, for that matter. So they say, no, I'm sorry, we don't accept women in the Philharmonic. And so she goes to this patron that she's got. She's got a patron, a woman who's on the board of directors of the New York Philharmonic. That's big, big money, right? And this patron has helped Frances with her career a lot. And Frances says, hey, can you help me get an audition? And her patroness says, no, I can't get you an audition. The Philharmonic's for men. They go on tour. If they go on tour, if you were with them, where would you sleep? And Frances said, with my husband, like I do every night here in New York. And they said, no, I'm sorry, you can't do it. So it was in 1967 when a flute position opened up again, and this is when Leonard Bernstein is conducting the Philharmonic, that they finally push to allow women to audition. And what they did was they created a new way of auditioning that's called blind auditions, where we put up a screen and the panel sits on one side of the screen and the auditioners come out and they play. And we just did auditions for the Springfield Symphony 2 weeks ago, and I did Topeka Symphony auditions last week. We do the exact same format that was established when they made this change in 1967. Sit behind a screen. We don't know who the candidate is. You don't know how old they are. You don't know if they're a man or a woman or what country they come from. We often ask them to take off their shoes so that you can't hear the clipping of high heels. And so, and someone sits at the edge of the screen, says, this is candidate one. And I say, candidate one, welcome. I'd like you to play this, this, and this. And they play, and then they go away, and then we make our decision afterwards. And when they did that, the women basically populated half of the orchestras. I mean, it was almost overnight. Half the positions started going to women. I mean, they had been blocking that. So Frances was the first. She was the first in there. There are lots of other amazing stories about her, but it was that influence of her, and it was the work ethic that she put forward and the demands that she made on me that sort of set me on my path to being a conductor. And I remember actually when I told her I was a junior, and I said, you know what, I'm going to go on in music. And she said, not as a flutist though, right? And I remember being really hurt. My feelings were hurt. And I said, no, as a conductor, but by the way, why not as a flutist? And she said, this was interesting. She said, look, she said 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you could have been a flutist in a major orchestra. Today, I don't think you could pass the screen audition. She said, you play well enough to play in the orchestra, but the screen audition changes the way that we hear music. And it's very, very true, because you put someone behind a screen and all you listen for is perfection. It's much harder to listen for musicality and soul and life. You hear every error. And so Frances said, look, I was a junior in college. She said, there are 16-year-old girls who have better fingers than you have, and they'll get behind a screen and they'll outplay your fingers. It doesn't mean that they would be a better flutist in the orchestra, but it's the way the world changed. And it changed largely because of her. And she was a little bit sad about that. I mean, she didn't feel like that made for the best way to figure out who should be in an orchestra. But I said, no, I want to be a conductor. And she said, okay, well, you have to apply this same level of seriousness to this career as a conductor. And she worked with all of them. And she said, more orchestras have saved the careers of bad conductors than you can even possibly imagine. And she said, I do not want you to be one of those conductors. You can't be one of those conductors who stands up in front of the orchestra and just puts on a show. It's got to be real music making. And interestingly, she told me a lot about Bernstein, because Bernstein, of course, was the music director when she joined the New York Philharmonic. And one of the things that she said about Bernstein was, when it was a closed rehearsal, when it was just the orchestra and the conductor, she never knew a more brilliant musical mind than Bernstein. And when you think about what she had to compare that to, which is everybody else, that's an amazing statement. But then she said, as soon as there was an audience in there or a camera in there, forget it. There was no music making going on anymore. It was just a show that he was putting on for the audience. And she said it's a real shame that no one can really see his genius music making, but those closed rehearsals between the Philharmonic and Bernstein were the most rewarding musical experiences of her life. And she said, that's how you have to be as a conductor. It has to be about that rehearsal and that music making. So let me leap ahead to what it is that a conductor does. Because if we don't make any sound, what's really the point of having us up there in the front? And I get this question because people will sit in the audience of the concert and they'll say to me, hey, it doesn't look like any of the musicians are looking at you. You're just waving your arms and they're all looking at the music. What's really going on? Is anybody actually, are you doing anything up there, or are you just waving your arms? And the truth is that the conductor's job and responsibility, what you see at the concert is 5%, and the 95% happens first in my studio or my office by myself with this score. And then the 50% happens with the orchestra in rehearsal. And then the 5% is actually at the concert itself. You'd think that it's the concerts that's a big deal. And there are all these myths. There's these stories. You know, Bernstein got his start when, was it Metropolis?
Bruno Walter.
Bruno Walter got sick, right? And Bernstein went up there on the stage and conducted, and it was brilliant. And it was brilliant. The guy was brilliant, no question about it.
It was a Sunday afternoon live network broadcast.
But he hadn't done the rehearsals.
Nope.
And so he got up there and literally just kind of waved his arms through. Honestly, the orchestra probably could have done it without him, but it created the myth of this man who could get up in front of the orchestra and be brilliant. But it's the rehearsal time that's really important. And the rehearsal time is where we are, where the conductor really comes in handy. Now, there are some orchestras that perform without a conductor. And you say, okay, well, if an orchestra can perform without a conductor, why don't all orchestras perform without a conductor? I mean, what's the point of this guy or gal up front, being the dictator saying you do it my way or no way? And the answer to that question comes from based on what it is that we do. So what is it that we do? Well, in classical music, as opposed to jazz or folk forms, we have a responsibility to these dots and lines that the composers put down. Our goal is to faithfully realize, without changing, what the music is that the composers wrote. And so if you look at this score here, basically what it is, and then I learned this really with my conducting teacher, who was a guy named Frederick Prausnitz, and I don't have time right now. Maybe you'll ask me questions about Prausnitz. But what we have in a sheet of music is a set of facts and a set of instructions. And the facts are pretty easy, although it's not easy to learn the facts are easy. So the fact is that at rehearsal 2 here, the clarinet plays an F. Now, how do you conduct that? How do you conduct an F? You can't conduct an F. There's no, that's not an F, that's not an F, that's not an F. You can't conduct an F. An F is a fact, and the clarinet player has that fact in front of them on their page, and they're going to play that F. If they don't play that F, I have to hear it, and I have to say, hey, clarinet, that's an F. You got to play an F. You're playing an F sharp, right? That's part of my job, but that's a fact. Facts are easy. Other facts, violins play, and in this bar it's in 4/4. That's a fact. It's 3 flats. That's a fact. The piano comes in here. It's a fact. And those are all facts. I've got to know them. I learn them. I study them. But those are the easy part. It's the instructions that are the key to what it is that a conductor does. And this actually comes down fundamentally to why one performance sounds different than another performance of the same piece of music. We all know that's true. Especially all of us as musicians, we all know that's true. Heck, Sting sounds different playing, singing Roxanne now than he did when he was singing it with the Police. It's different in the context. And if somebody covers it, it's going to sound even more different. And yet the facts of the piece are the same. The words are the same, the notes are the same, the time is the same. Now, whether it's Roxanne or Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto, that is still going to be true. The facts are the same. So we're going to play that on Saturday with Daniel Shu, who's one of the Van Cliburn competition winners. And it's going to sound different than the last time I played it with a guy named John Nakamatsu, who was another Van Cliburn competition winner. And it's going to sound different than when Van Cliburn played it, and it's going to sound different than when Rachmaninoff played it. Now, Rachmaninoff wrote the piece, So you might argue, okay, well, he wrote the piece. We got a recording of him playing it. Why don't we all try to play it exactly the same way that he played it, because he's the composer and the performer? Good luck with that. Yeah, right, exactly. And then you say, but hey, Bernstein wrote the Candide Overture, which is another piece that we're going to play, and I listened to 5 different recordings of Bernstein doing his own piece, and it was done 5 different ways, and he is the composer, and he was the conductor. So, why is one piece different than another? And it comes down to the instructions that we have. So what are the instructions? Well, the basic ones, the easiest ones to get your head around are loud and soft. So I'm going to ask this question. It's not a rhetorical question. It's a real question. How loud is loud? How? Hella? Loud. Yeah, that's a pretty darn good answer. Loud is louder than soft. That's my answer. It sounds flippant, but it's not flippant.
Lines are all loud.
What's that?
Lines are all loud.
Yeah. The thing about loud is if I'm playing my flute for you in this room, I can play as loud as I possibly can play, and it might sound pretty loud to you. But then put me out on the football field again, and I play as loud as I possibly can, and you won't even hear it, right? In the context of the orchestra, how loud is loud? Well, loud when the strings are playing is different than loud when the brass is playing. So that's basic, right? I mean, that's pretty easy, and that's sort of intuitive that I have to make a decision about how loud that is. So how fast is fast? It's faster than slow. Now, this can get a little bit more complicated because, at least since the early 1800s, we've had this metronome thing that will set time. And so sometimes composers will say, hey, I want it at 60 beats a minute. But then go listen to Bernstein. And so Bernstein, we're playing the Candide Overture this weekend, and it's a fast piece. And so he's marked in the score, quarter note is 152 beats a minute. That's a pretty quick clip. Click, 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 click. And then you listen to his performance of it, and I've got a little metronome that I can tap in, and it'll tell me what the tempo is. And he's going like 178 beats per minute. I mean, he's not even in the ballpark of his own tempo that he wrote and that he marked down. And then you find that's from back in 1957, 58. And now I look at another performance that he did in 86 or 87 when he's an old man, and now he's going 142. So he wrote the tempo. That's the guy who put that tempo down on the score, and he's 178 and 142. There's another recording that's 152.
Maybe it's just supposed to be arranged.
Maybe it's supposed to be arranged, but that's why that even though something is written down that looks like it's supposed to be a fact is actually an instruction. That we still have to make a decision on it, because that fast can be determined. You're in a big giant resonant hall where the sound kind of jumbles up, and if you go too fast, you can't hear any clarity of it. So fast needs to sound different if you're in a studio space with dead acoustics where it's being recorded than it is when you're in this live hall. Same thing with loud and soft. Those are kind of simple ones. Then it gets more complicated. I can look at this and I can say, okay, hey, at this spot at rehearsal number 2 here, I can see that the horn and the viola are playing the same line. Okay, so which of these two does the composer want us to hear? He's marked piano for both of them. So he's marked soft for horn and he's marked soft for viola. And they're playing the same thing. So I've got to make a decision. What do we want to hear? And then I can look carefully and say, oh, actually the bassoon is playing another melody. So there are 2 melodies that are happening at the exact same time. So which of these 2 melodies do we want to hear? And there's nothing in here that says, I want to hear this melody. You just see the line on the bassoon, and you see the horn line and the viola line, and they're both marked soft. So I have to make a decision. Now, I'm going to come back to that question I posed earlier. Why do we even bother having a conductor? Well, the truth is that an orchestra of 80 people, they could make these decisions as a body. You could have 80 people, when they get to rehearsal 2, say, hey, what do we want to hear more, the viola or the horn? Or the bassoon player goes, hey, what about me? I want you to hear me. And like the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra it's a small orchestra. It's a 40-piece orchestra. They don't play the giant orchestral pieces. And they do that. They make their decisions by consensus. And they take...
The first violinist leads the tempo.
Yeah, they take ages to put together their recordings and their concerts. So they'll take weeks to do that. We have 4 rehearsals to put together a concert. And with 85 people, you can't, in the space of 4 2.5-hour rehearsals, make those decisions as a collective. And so basically, I am entrusted with making the decisions for the orchestra. And so I spend many, many hours by myself with the music making those decisions. And so both from Francis and from my conducting teacher, Maestro Prausnitz, they instilled on me the importance of that you don't ever set foot on the podium in front of that orchestra until you have made up your mind. So I don't get up there and say, hey, folks, let's try it this way. And now let's try it this way. Now, I'll say we're going to do it this way, and then sometimes it doesn't work. And then I'll say, nope, that didn't work. We're going to do it a different way. But it's not my job to experiment up there in front of those people. I've got 85 people who have all put in many, many hours and many, many, many years of experience to be in the Springfield Symphony. And I owe it to them to also have made up my mind about how we're going to do the things that we're going to do. Then, of course, we, with this Rachmaninoff piece, for instance, we have another factor, which is we bring in the soloist. And so I've worked with the orchestra, I've made my decisions, but then the soloist comes in and it's really his piece. And so my job is to support him. And that's something that, quite honestly, I don't think an orchestra can really do without a conductor with a piece of this magnitude. I mean, it's just too hard. My job is to be the intermediary between this pianist and then the 85 people who are on the other side of me. So the pianist sits behind me, I sit in the middle, I stand in the middle, the orchestra is behind me, I'm listening to the pianist, and I'm trying to keep us all together and do what the pianist wants to do. I'm going to come back to Bernstein for a minute, though, because there are times, here's a question. How fast is fast in a Rachmaninoff concerto? The answer is usually it's as fast as the soloist wants to play it. That's pretty much how fast is, because if he says, I'm going this fast, I'm going to say
You're going to have to go along with him.
pretty much okay. Now, there's a very famous story about the pianist Glenn Gould, who is a wonderful, iconic, strange pianist. Those of you who were alive in the 60s probably remember that his Goldberg Variations recording actually was way up on the hit parade along with the Beatles. So you've got Glenn Gould doing Bach's Goldberg Variations on the piano and outselling a Beatles album. He was a weird guy, Glenn Gould. There's a great film, if you have never seen, it's 38 short films about Glenn Gould? 32 short films? Oh, because of the Goldberg Variations, yeah. He's an oddball. And so there's this, and he was known for bailing out on performances. The orchestra would hire him, he'd bail out at the last minute. There's a recording, you can go on YouTube and you can listen to it. It's the weirdest thing you've ever heard if you've been to a lot of orchestra concerts. Glenn Gould was playing Brahms' first piano concerto with the New York Philharmonic with Leonard Bernstein conducting in the early 70s.
Late 60s.
Late 60s. And Bernstein walks out before the performance and says, well, folks, I've got some good news and some bad news. And the whole audience just kind of goes, because they figured that means that Gould has canceled out. And Bernstein says, no, Glenn Gould is going to play, and everybody goes, yeah. And then Bernstein says, I have to say, this is one of the most weaselly things I think he ever did. Bernstein says, the soloist and I disagree on how this piece is supposed to be played, but I'm going to do what he wants to do, which is kind of like coming out and saying, I think this is not right, but if you don't like it, it's his fault, not mine. That's really not the way it's supposed to be done. But that's what happens when you have two titanic figures in music and two titanic egos in music as well. And so those two, went up against each other. So anyway, that's the nutshell of what my job is. I mean, honestly, a lot of my job is raising money. A lot of my job is raising awareness and doing commercials and talking to groups and setting a season and firing musicians. But that's not why you get into being a conductor. You get into being a conductor, at least in my case, because you want to be involved in every aspect of the music that is being played. And so I get to make decisions about every aspect of the music and not just the flute line. And so that's fundamentally what it is that I do. Randy, you want to?
I'll throw in a few things. Yeah. You were talking about making sure that you're prepared in every aspect of the score when you go into the first rehearsal, because you don't want to waste the orchestra's time. Do you, now this of course, and before basically the 1920s, this really wasn't possible in any great amount. The question of listening to recordings that already exist, recordings by other musicians of those same pieces for study or even for inspiration. Do you do any of that, or do you simply rely on what's on the printed page?
That's a fantastic question and a really interesting issue. There is who conducted the Boston Symphony? Leinsdorf. Was it Leinsdorf who wrote the Composer's Advocate? Yeah, in the 60s. Okay, yeah. All right. So my teacher Frederick Prausnitz, was a great. He was a German immigrant, but he basically grew up in the United States. We consider him an American conductor. He studied in the United States, and he was the first American conductor to win the Mahler Prize. And when he was in Boston. He worked at New England Conservatory in Boston. There was a conductor of the Boston Symphony called Erich Leinsdorf, who's a famous conductor. He was a great conductor.
Yes, he was.
He wrote a book called The Composer's Advocate, where he argued that the conductor's job is to be the advocate for the composer because the composer's not here. They can't tell us how they want it, so we have to be responsible to the score, and which is all great. And in that book, he said, never, ever, 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 ever listen to a recording. That as you're preparing, it is not legitimate to listen to a recording of somebody else playing a piece. Meister Prausnitz said, when he was working in Boston, he used to see Leinsdorf in the record store all the time, and he bought records of every piece that he was going to conduct. Now,
he was doing it just to make fun of them.
Well, that could be true. That could be true. So the way that you learn to be a conductor has changed dramatically in the last century. Prior to the last century, you became a conductor by being an apprentice. So you were basically a musician in the pit, and you would say to the conductor, "Hey, I'd like to help you out," and then they would say, "Okay, well, here's the score, learn it," and then basically. You waited for the conductor to get sick, and someone said, "Does anybody know what to do here?" And you say, "Yeah, I do." And then you jump up there and you conduct, and suddenly you're a conductor. I mean, honestly, it's not a joke either. That's kind of the way it happened. It's how Toscanini got there. It's how Stokowski got there. It's how Bernstein effectively got there. And so most of the way that you would learn the score prior to the 30s was at the piano. So if I wanted to learn this piece, I would sit down at a piano and I would play my way through it, which means that most of the conductors up until the 1930s were pianists. It's an enormous skill. I can't do it. I can't sit down at the piano and play this. Now, you can learn how to do it, but it's hard, and it takes years and years of practice to learn how to condense, 80 lines. I mean, you're condensing all of this down to 10 fingers if you want to play it at the piano. That's a great skill. It's an interesting skill. But my teacher, Meister Prausnitz, he had a different philosophy. He took most of us who were in his class were orchestral players. So I was a flutist. My friend was a violinist or a cellist or a French horn player. So if you're a pianist and you wanted to be a conductor, you'd go to Juilliard School. If you're a player and you wanted to be a conductor, like I was, you went to Peabody, where Meister Prausnitz was. And Meister Prausnitz's philosophy about that was that what we really have to do as a conductor is to hear 80 lines in our head. And he thought that if you sat at the piano and you condensed 80 lines to a maximum of 10 lines with your 10 fingers, but let's be honest, it's not really probably going to be 10 lines, it'd be 4, 5, 6 lines, you were actually condensing the sound picture. And he wanted us to learn it and visualize. So when I look at this and I look at this viola line, he wanted me to actually visualize and think about where that viola sound comes from, and not only where it comes from, but who's playing it. So I look at this right here at rehearsal 2, and I see viola, and so I think about the viola players of the Springfield Symphony who sit to my right, and I know that Kirsten Weiss is sitting right here next to Ned Horner, and I know that the sound is going to come from there. And so I'm trying to imagine that in my head when I look at this. Same thing with the French horn. I know exactly where that's going to come from and what that's going to sound like and what the color and timbre is going to be, and not my fourth finger playing that in this particular octave, that he wanted us to expand rather than contract the piece. So he said, and I do this, he said, listen to recordings. I mean, if you don't know a piece, you got to hear the piece. And for the most part, I mean, unless you're doing something brand new, which we do from time to time, but unless you're doing something brand new, there are recordings. I mean, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, we played it last year. Now I've conducted it 15 times, but also there are, 55 recordings or more of doing that. But what he did say also was, don't just listen to one recording. Listen to as many recordings as you can get your hands on. For one thing, you don't want to be ingrained. We're not trying, even if it's Rachmaninoff playing Rachmaninoff, we're not trying to imitate what he did. We're just getting the reference points on the facts. And so, yes, the answer is I do listen to recordings, and I listen to recordings for the reference points on the facts. And then you still have to make the decisions for yourself. And I'll give you another instance. I keep coming back to Bernstein because we're talking about Bernstein a lot. It's his 100th anniversary just within the last month or so. Mm-hmm. He has a recording of the Brahms symphonies. I know you know these. They're famous with the Vienna Philharmonic. The Second Symphony I love. He plays that slow movement. It's just excruciatingly slow. I mean, it's unbelievably slow. It's in no way what Brahms would have indicated. It works. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous. And I can't do it. I've tried. And believe me, I can't do it. I don't have enough cellos. They're not the Vienna Philharmonic. We're not playing in the Philharmonie in Vienna. Our hall doesn't resonate the way his hall did. He has 16 cellos. I have 8. I can't do what he did there. So it's useless for me to try to imitate what he did, aside from the facts of just knowing how it's supposed to sound.
But you can still gain some great insights into what the possibilities of the piece are by hearing different sorts of approaches.
Yeah. I sort of feel like if I don't steal good ideas, I'm being very irresponsible. We're playing music, in some cases it's been 200-300 years old, right? People have been playing it for 200 or 300 years. Why should I reinvent it from scratch? And now, if I'm copying someone else, that doesn't make sense. But if I can integrate someone's good idea into my overall picture, then I think that's a good idea. And quite honestly, I do that with the orchestra all the time, because I can come up with this perfect image in my head of what this piece is supposed to sound like, and then I stand in front of 85 players and they play, and so I've got a flutist who's a spectacular flutist, and she plays the line and she plays it differently than I thought it would be, but it's great. So instead of saying, nope, you do it the way I wanted it to be done, I integrate her performance into my concept of the piece.
There are some conductors who will, though, insist.
There are fewer and fewer. I think that there's, there was a time when conductors were very dictatorial and would say, my way or you're fired. And because of that, we got the musicians union. Because of that, we got protections for players. Because of that, there's a pretty famous story. Toscanini was a real tyrant. He would scream at the orchestra. He would break his baton and throw it.
Go on YouTube. You can hear numerous recorded. NBC would. Oh, here. Yeah. Go on YouTube. NBC would record. Their engineers would record the rehearsals of the NBC Symphony. And you can hear Toscanini just throwing huge tantrums at the orchestra in pig English and pig Italian, and just and calling them pigs, and they took it.
They took it, but he would fire people. Violence. There's this famous moment in Beethoven 5 where it's really rolling, da 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 dum, da 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 dum, and then there's this extra bar. Beethoven throws in this extra bar of rest. And there's this famous story about this guy who played with the Philharmonic for 30 years. He was about to retire. He's a violinist, and he played in that rest. And Toscanini pointed at him and said, fired him at will. But the story, when Toscanini left, his assistant took over for 2 years. You can probably remember who.
John Barbaroli was.
It wasn't Barbaroli. It was a younger guy. And apparently he got up there. Francis told me the story from Alex. He got up there and started throwing the tantrums and screaming and yelling.
At NBC.
At NBC.
Guido Cantelli.
Yeah, it was Cantelli, Guido Cantelli. And apparently the orchestra got up, walked out, and the management said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We took it from the old man. We're not going to take it from anybody else." So that doesn't really happen quite like that anymore.
But just the fact that it does still happen at times is, you think of Charles Dutoit, who I mean I know people who have worked under him, and he can be a tyrant.
Yeah.
Of course, he can also be a sex abuser too, but that's another matter. I was going to ask you to talk about briefly, anyway, if you can make it brief, because it's a huge subject. Yeah, make it short. All right, wrap it up. When you talk to young'uns, what do you tell them in terms of encouragement, or maybe discouragement for that matter, about a career in classical music? When you're talking to kids.
A career in music is hard. You all know that. It doesn't matter if it's classical music or pop music or folk music. A career in music is hard. It used to really bother me when one of the pieces of advice I heard a lot, my wife is an actor too, which is also not a great career, and we both heard the same thing a lot. People would say, if you can do anything else, you should do it. And I profoundly disagree with that statement.
You got a day job?
I can do a lot of things, but it doesn't mean that I should do a lot of things, or that you want to. On the other hand, I've been doing this for just about 20 years now. Actually, I think next year will be 20. This is 19 years. And I would say that when I've had some young people who want to be conductors, and they come and talk to me, and I just say, you have to really go into it with your eyes open about what the career is. I spend 90% of my time not doing music. 90, I would say, at least, is everything but conducting. And so if you stuff like this. Now this I count because we're talking about music. So I mean I count this as being kind of musical related. But I spend so much time fundraising. I spend so much time doing administrative and publicity work, and
with your staff.
In meetings with boards, and we have great boards, and we have great staff, and we have a supportive community here, and I still spend 90% of my time doing it. And as you mentioned at the outset, there are a lot of places where orchestras are really, really struggling, and I've been in those places. And then you're doing 95% of your time not actually making music. The other thing that's odd about being a conductor is it's a little bit of a lonely profession, in that you're not part of the orchestra. And if you're someone who was an orchestral player, like I was, I miss that camaraderie a little bit because you're not part of them. Now, it doesn't mean they don't like you, but you're not one of them, because they have to agree to do what you say. So, and then there are times I'm sure they all go out to the bar afterwards and say, that guy's a real idiot. And then sometimes they say, boy, that was really great. It's just the nature of what this job is. And so, I do advise people to kind of keep their eyes open. Do we have time for a couple questions?
Questions from the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Gary.
There are the facts, and I assume you can't change those.
Right.
What can change is the interpretation of the instructions. And with that probably comes a reputation. He's a fast guy, or he's a slow guy. Or
Yeah.
he favors the flutes over the strings. Well, what's your reputation?
That's a great one.
That is a fantastic question that I probably can't answer. You're probably going to have to ask someone else, one of those players at the bar afterwards. Okay, so the question is, different conductors have different things that they focus on. Is really the way to explain that question, and based on the way that you'll notice, actually, probably you may have noticed that I never use the word interpretation. I actually don't really like that word, because to me it's not interpreting it, it's making decisions on. But it's kind of standard to say Bernstein's interpretation, or whoever's interpretation. Well, I will tell you I'll tell you what I care about, and so I hope that is the way that it comes across to the audience, and that my players also understand what I'm asking. I am always very concerned about the sound, the color, the sound quality and color. There are some conductors who are very concerned, say, with the rhythmic stability or the active precision, or but for me, I have worked really hard for 5 years, sometimes to the frustration of the orchestra, at getting them to change their color. So the strings, which really is the basic fundamental body of the orchestra, is the strings. I mean, that doesn't downplay the importance of winds, brass, percussion, but the strings create the main sound of the orchestra. Our job as string players is often to be leading melody, but also many times to be accompanying. And many orchestras make no distinction between the sound that the strings make in those instances. And so, I have worked to try to get them, and there's some very specific technical things that I've done with them to try to do that. Strings vibrate. All of the instruments basically vibrate. We call it vibrato, and it creates an interesting tone. And when a string vibrates, you can see this hand is actually moving, and what it's really doing in this fast motion is going up and down on the string. So it's making the pitch go up and down. So it's really going, whoa, but it's doing so fast that you don't hear it as a pitch change. But what it does is it adds width and width to the frequencies that are being set out. So A is 440, but when you're vibrating on A, you might be going from 438 to 442, or you might be going from 432 to 448, if you're vibrating wide wah or B. And a lot of orchestras, a lot of string players they just vibrate the way they vibrate. And so for the last 5 years, I've been asking them to vibrate differently for different purposes. So for instance, when I need to hear the flute come out over, if you have a solo flute coming out over all the strings, I ask the strings to vibrate very narrow and very fast, so that it's a rapid, kind of gives a little bit of sheen to the sound. They finally got together and asked me to stop saying shimmer, because I would ask them to shimmer, and they finally said, please stop saying that to us. And I said, okay, I'm going to find another way to do it. So that's what I pay attention to.
Yeah, I would say, in my mind, your reputation is for more adventurous programming. I've been following the symphony for over 30 years, and kind of got stuck in a Beethoven, Brahms, Mozart thingy for a long time. With that in mind, next time you consider the meaning of life,
Yeah.
Samuel Barber's second essay for orchestra.
I love that piece. It may come around next year. I will tell you this. I'm gonna give you a hint. It's nothing is decided, but next year it's my plan to have an American season. And so Barber's second essay is on that list. Do we have time for one more? There was one more at the back. Yeah.
It's quick. I really appreciate your approach as a conductor as far as tonality, sound, arrangement. Your view on that is really parallel with how I approach my career and what I do. But my question is completely off topic in a way. Do you have time, or do you have any interest in composing yourself?
That's a good question. The question is, do I have interest in composing? And the answer is, I have a certain amount of interest in it, but for the most part, conducting and composing are kind of incompatible. And you see that even with the great composer-conductors like Mahler or Bernstein. They had to take time off of the conducting in order to compose, because when you are conducting, you are really filling your head with other people's music. And so, Mahler used to take the whole summer off of conducting, and he basically only composed in the summertime when the symphony season was off. Right now, with my level of busyness between the two orchestras, I take the summer to study the music, to make the decisions. So I'm using the summer to put together the season. And but the real truth is, I just don't have any talent at it. I mean, I had to do it. In grad school. I had to do it as an undergrad. My compositions are perfunctory and correct. That's the best you can say about them. They are not inspiring or wonderful. Now, I do have a little project in mind that when I have a little bit of time, it's a compositional type of project. Brahms is my favorite composer. He wrote a few chamber pieces. He wrote a quintet, he wrote a sextet, and Arnold Schoenberg, who was a great composer, took those and made symphonies out of them. Brahms also has a piano trio that would make a great symphony, and I have it in my mind to do an orchestration. So you're actually using someone else's genius and creativity, and then you have to apply your creativity into changing it from one format to another. And it's in my mind to do. I've started working on it a little bit, but that's really, and you know, who knows, maybe with that project, if I really get going on it, it might spark some creative, you know, some composition. But I really look at my job. My job is to immerse myself in other people's musical genius and try to realize that into physical sound.
Thank you very much. Kyle, I want to thank you very much for a wonderful presentation today, and also to Randy, the voice of KSMU, Stuart, for adding a lot of value today.
Oh, I hope I do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And again, very wonderful that some of our symphony people have come out to see you today. They probably know a lot more about you now. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.